Paris, the city of light, the city of romance, and in the years right after the First World War, also the city of exhaustion. Imagine it. The war ended in 1918, but the shadow of it stretched across the early 1920s like a long evening shadow that refused to fade. The streets were alive, but not in the same way they had been before. There were gaps, empty chairs at tables, sons and brothers who never came home, widows in black who walked with slow steps. And yet, mixed in with all of the sadness, there was something else. Something restless, a hunger for beauty, a hunger for distraction, a hunger for life. Paris in the early 1920s was like someone slowly waking up after a long, heavy sleep. Groggy, a little lost, but also ready for a cup of strong coffee and maybe, just maybe, a cigarette. And if you picture that, then you are already close to the feeling of the city in those years. Now, the thing about Paris is that it's always had a reputation for elegance. But elegance in 1920 looked different than elegance in 1910. The war had shaken things up. Corsets were starting to loosen. Hemlines were creeping up. And women, Parisian women in particular, were walking the streets with a new sense of independence. People noticed. They couldn't help it. But before we jump into the glamour, the cabarets, and the smoky jazz clubs, we need to understand the backdrop. Paris wasn't just twinkling lights and perfumes. It was still recovering. The cost of the war was heavy. Nearly every family had lost someone. Entire neighborhoods had changed. And yet, somehow, the city moved forward. The mornings in Paris were filled with routine. Bakeries opened their doors, fresh bread stacked on wooden counters, the smell of coffee drifting into the streets. People still read their newspapers at the corner cafe, even if the news was often heavy with politics, rebuilding, and the endless debates about what the future should look like. Life was ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. And for women, especially Parisian women, this was a strange moment. On one hand, society was still conservative. On the other hand, the war had opened doors. Many women had worked during the war while men were gone. Some drove trams, others worked in offices. And when the war ended, not all of them wanted to step quietly back into the home. That push and pull between tradition and change was the tension of the 1920s. But let's slow down a bit, because the magic of bedtime history isn't in racing through names and dates. It's in pausing on the little details. So picture a quiet Paris in 1920, the cobblestones still damp from rain, a woman in a simple dark dress carrying a basket of apples from the market, a man in a bowler hat tipping it politely, though his eyes lingered just a second too long. Life was simple, yes, but underneath, things were shifting. What made Parisian women seem so alluring in this moment wasn't just beauty. It wasn't even fashion, not yet. It was a kind of mood, a sense that they were carrying secrets the rest of the world hadn't caught up to. Maybe it was the confidence of having survived a war. Maybe it was the thrill of change in the air. Or maybe it was just the fact that they knew how to walk through the streets like they belonged there. And belonging? Well, that's always attractive. And then there was the city itself. Paris has always been a stage, and in the 1920s, it felt especially like a theater. The wide boulevards, the bridges over the Seine, the lamplight that made even the most ordinary cafe look a little romantic after dark. Women in Paris weren't just living their lives, they were performing, whether they meant to or not. Every stroll, every laugh, every puff of cigarette smoke, it all added to the legend. Of course, not everyone approved. Older generations looked at bobbed hair and shorter skirts with raised eyebrows. Shocking, they whispered. Unladylike. But whispering only made it more tempting. It's always that way, isn't it? Tell someone not to do something, and suddenly it becomes twice as interesting. And so Parisian women walked a delicate line between respectability and rebellion, between tradition and freedom. And this balancing act gave them an air of mystery, the so-called dark allure. Was it dangerous? Was it charming? Was it both? Well, that depended on who you asked. Now, if you could stand on the corner of Boulevard Saint-Germain in 1920, you'd see this play out in real time. The cafés packed with people, the waiters weaving between tiny tables with trays of coffee and wine. Women leaning back in their chairs, smoking casually, something that would have been nearly scandalous a decade earlier. And men watching, pretending not to be fascinated, but failing. And beyond the glamour, there was still the reality of a city carrying scars. Buildings were worn down. Families struggled to rebuild. Prices were high. But maybe it was exactly this mix of hardship and beauty that made the Parisian woman so captivating. She was both real and untouchable, both part of the world's pain and somehow above it. At night, Paris began to glow. Streetlights flickered on, music drifted from dance halls, and women, not dressed in the heavy layers of the past, but in lighter, freer styles, walked out into the evening. They were not rushing, they were strolling. Parisian women always strolled, and there's something about strolling that says, I have time, I have presence, I am worth watching. And people did watch. Tourists wrote about them in letters home. Writers scribbled down descriptions in notebooks. Foreign artists painted them, trying to capture that air of something both ordinary and mysterious. The Parisian woman became less of a person and more of a symbol. So as we begin our journey into the 1920s, keep this image in mind. Paris at twilight. The war over, but not forgotten. A city caught between mourning and celebration. And at the center of it all, the Parisian woman, walking slowly, confidently, as if she knew something the rest of the world didn't. And maybe she did. If Paris had a heartbeat in the 1920s, you'd probably hear it echoing inside a cafe. Not in a hospital, not in a palace, but in those little corner cafes with wooden chairs that creaked if you sat down too fast. Parisian life happened there. It still does, to be honest, but in the years after the Great War, the cafe wasn't just a place to sip coffee. It was a stage, a classroom, a confessional, and sometimes a battlefield of gossip. Morning in Paris meant newspapers spread across tables, coffee cups clinking, waiters sliding between chairs with a tray balanced like circus performers. Some customers came to read the headlines. Others came to be seen. And the Parisian woman, she came to make an impression without looking like she was trying, which is a talent on its own. Now, if you think of cafes today, you might imagine tourists with cameras or students with laptops. But back then, the cafe crowd was a mix of artists, writers, businessmen, and women who were starting to push their way into public life. And it wasn't just about drinking coffee. The menu, for one thing, was an entire ritual. Tiny cups of espresso so strong they could probably wake the dead. Glasses of wine, even before noon, because why not? Plates of croissants flaking all over the tablecloth. And you know how crumbs are annoying? Well, in Paris, they were almost artistic. A trail of pastry flakes leading like breadcrumbs to someone's conversation. But the true magic wasn't on the plate. It was in the way cafes became living rooms for the whole city. They were places where women could smoke in public, still scandalous to some, where they could read a book and not be questioned, where they could lean back in their chairs, one arm draped loosely, and make eye contact across the room that said more than an entire novel. Salons were the more polished cousins of cafés. If the café was public theater, the salon was a private concert. Run by women, usually in elegant apartments, salons gathered artists, poets, and intellectuals. You didn't just wander into a salon, you had to be invited. And being invited meant you mattered, or at least someone thought you might. In these salons, Parisian women weren't just ornaments, they were directors. They controlled the guest list, the topics of conversation, the flow of ideas. They decided whether the evening's talk would be about politics, or painting, or the latest shocking novel. In a time when women still couldn't vote in France, here they were, pulling the strings of culture from behind velvet curtains. That's a kind of power you can't write into law. And of course, salons had their own little details too. The smell of candles and perfume mingling, the clink of glass as champagne was poured, chairs pulled into circles as if the whole room was leaning in to hear a secret, conversations spilling over each other, philosophy in one corner, flirtation in another. It was never just about words, it was about the atmosphere. The café and salon together created the perfect contrast, one public, one private, one noisy, one refined. And Parisian women moved between both with ease. In cafés, they could show independence. In salons, they could show influence. It was a dance, subtle and deliberate, and the city applauded every step. Now, you might wonder, why were people so fascinated by women in these spaces? Wasn't it just normal social life? Well, yes and no. In a society still recovering from war, where roles were shifting and traditions were bending, seeing women claim space so confidently was new. It was modern. It was a little dangerous, and people found it impossible to look away. Picture it like this. A young woman with short bobbed hair walks into a cafe. She lights a cigarette, not hurried, not shy, but with the air of someone who knows she has the right to be there. She laughs too loudly at something her friend says, and heads turn. Not because she's the most beautiful woman in Paris, but because she radiates something else. Permission. Permission to live, to enjoy, to be seen. That was the allure. Of course, not every woman in Paris was living this café salon life. Many were still at home, raising families or working long hours just to get by. But the women who sat in those public spaces, shaping conversations and being noticed, became symbols. Symbols of change. Symbols of the city's resilience. And foreign visitors lapped it up. American writers especially couldn't get enough of Paris. They filled diaries and letters with descriptions of smoky rooms, strong drinks, and the mysterious women who seemed both approachable and untouchable. To them, the café was more than a café. It was a glimpse into freedom. And the Parisian woman was the face of that freedom. Let's not forget the little everyday things, though. Chairs that wobbled, coffee that sometimes arrived lukewarm, the occasional waiter who rolled his eyes at customers who lingered too long with only one drink. Because history isn't just about the glamorous parts. It's also about the slightly boring, slightly funny, ordinary details. And maybe that's what made the cafés so real. They were human. By the mid-1920s, the café culture was unstoppable. New jazz records played from gramophones. Newspapers carried stories of fashion trends started by women spotted at certain tables. Salons grew bolder, hosting debates that lasted deep into the night. And through it all, Parisian women kept weaving themselves into the very fabric of the city. So, if you imagine Paris in the 1920s, don't just picture the Eiffel Tower or the grand boulevards. Picture a café table, 2 chairs, a small glass of red wine, and a woman with an amused smile as she listens, observes, and maybe says nothing at all. That quiet presence could change the whole room. And maybe that's the real secret. The allure wasn't just in looks or fashion or perfume, it was in being part of the heartbeat of Paris. The cafés and salons gave women space to breathe, to shine, and to whisper new ideas into the ears of the city. And once Paris heard them, the world would too. Fashion in Paris during the 1920s was not just about clothes. It was about freedom, rebellion, and sometimes about confusing your grandmother. Because if you were a Parisian woman in 1920 and you chopped your hair into a neat little bob, slipped into a loose dress that barely brushed your knees, and walked out into the street with a cigarette dangling from your fingers, well, you weren't just getting dressed. You were declaring war on tradition. The flapper silhouette was not invented in Paris, but Parisian women made it an art form. They took what might have looked like a passing trend in New York or London and gave it elegance, depth, and that special kind of Parisian confidence. And suddenly, the flapper wasn't just a girl at a party. She was a symbol of an entire generation. Let's start with the hair. Before the war, women's hair was long, pinned up in heavy styles, sometimes under enormous hats that looked like they could shade an entire picnic. But the war changed everything. Long hair was impractical in factories, hospitals, and offices. Women needed to move quickly, work with machines, and live without fuss. So, when the war ended, many never went back. They cut their hair short. The bob arrived. Older generations gasped. Short hair on a woman? Scandalous. What would become of femininity? Surely civilization would collapse. Spoiler alert, it didn't. In fact, short hair became the mark of the modern woman. A woman who didn't care what her great-aunt thought. A woman who had seen too much in the war to fuss about hairpins. Then there were the dresses. Before, women's clothes were built like architecture. Layers of fabric, stiff corsets, bodices, and skirts that seemed to weigh more than the women wearing them. But in the 1920s, Parisian fashion houses, Chanel, Lanvin, Coiret, tore down those structures. The new silhouette was straight, simple, and surprisingly liberating. Dresses skimmed the body instead of squeezing it. Waists dropped low, almost at the hips. And for the first time in centuries, women could actually breathe. Breathing is underrated, but it's a pretty big deal. Of course, not everyone cheered. Critics complained that women now looked like little boys. Where are the curves, they moaned. But for Parisian women, that was the point. They didn't want to be decorative dolls anymore. They wanted to move, to dance, to live without carrying 10 pounds of fabric around their ankles. And if a few men thought they looked less feminine, well, that was their problem. Accessories became part of the fun. Long strings of pearls, sometimes reaching almost to the knees, swung as women danced. Cloche hats fit snugly over short hair, giving women the look of modern helmets from modern battles. Cigarette holders, slim and elegant, became not just tools, but statements. Yes, I'm smoking in public. Yes, you can stare. And the shoes. Let's not forget the shoes. Out went the high-button boots of the Edwardian era. In came strappy heels and Mary Janes, perfect for dancing the Charleston. A Parisian woman in the 1920s didn't just walk. She glided, she twirled, she stomped in rhythm with jazz. And the shoes told the story. Now, fashion always carries a whisper of politics, whether people admit it or not, and the flapper silhouette was a quiet revolution. Short hair and straight dresses were more than just style. They were a rejection of the idea that women should be bound, controlled, or hidden. They were a visible sign of independence. Every bobbed head and every dropped waist was like a little flag waving. Times are changing. It wasn't only about rebellion, though. It was also about joy.
Imagine Paris after years of war, grief, and rationing. Suddenly, the streets were filled with color. Fabric shimmered with sequins. Dresses sparkled under electric lights. Women danced in clothes that moved with them instead of against them. It was fun, it was playful, and it was a little bit daring. And here's the thing. Parisian women knew how to wear it. Fashion wasn't just on their bodies, it was in their posture, their stride, their confidence. A dress in New York might look like a dress. In Paris, the same dress became a story, an atmosphere, a piece of living art. People didn't just see clothes, they saw allure. Tourists noticed immediately. Foreigners came to Paris expecting romance, and they found it hanging in the very fabric of women's dresses. Magazines carried the styles across oceans. American women clipped photos of Parisian models and rushed to copy them. The flapper look spread like wildfire, but it always seemed most at home in Paris, where style wasn't just an accessory, it was part of the air. Of course, not every woman became a flapper. Many still wore traditional clothes, but the presence of flappers in the cafés, on the boulevards, in the dance halls created an atmosphere. It said, this is the future, this is what freedom looks like, and whether you loved it or hated it, you couldn't ignore it. Even Coco Chanel herself played into this idea. She once said that luxury must be comfortable, otherwise it's not luxury at all. And she gave women clothes they could actually live in, dresses you could move in, jackets you could work in, perfumes that made you feel invisible and unforgettable at the same time. Paris became the workshop where modern femininity was designed, stitched, and displayed. But here's a little secret. The flapper silhouette wasn't just about the women wearing it. It was about the effect it had on everyone watching. Men were fascinated, sometimes bewildered. Older women shook their heads but secretly admired the courage. Younger girls looked up and thought, maybe I'll cut my hair too. The silhouette didn't just change bodies, it changed minds. And so, when we think about the Parisian woman of the 1920s, we can't separate her from her clothes. The loose dresses, the bobbed hair, the cloche hats, the pearls. They weren't just fashion choices, they were declarations. Declarations that the old world was gone, and a new one was strutting down the boulevard with a sly smile and a sparkle in his step. So next time you see a photo of those women from the 1920s with their sleek dresses and mischievous eyes, remember this. They weren't dressing to look pretty. They were dressing to feel free. And in Paris, freedom always came with a touch of style. If fashion was the skin of the Parisian woman in the 1920s, perfume was her invisible aura. Clothes showed the world who you were, but perfume whispered who you wanted to be. And in Paris, where style was practically a religion, that whisper carried farther than you might expect. The streets of Paris had their own smells, fresh bread from boulangeries, roasted chestnuts on corners, cigarette smoke curling out of cafés. But when a woman passed by and left a trail of perfume in her wake, it was like a signature in the air. You might not remember her face, but you'd remember the scent. And sometimes that was more powerful. Now, perfume wasn't new in the 1920s. Women had been dabbing lavender water and rose oils for centuries. What was new was how perfume was used. Before, it was delicate, almost shy, something to mask the smells of daily life in cities that weren't exactly known for their plumbing. But in the 1920s, perfume became bold, it became modern, it became art. And no one captured this better than Coco Chanel. In 1921, she introduced Chanel No. 5, and the world of fragrance was never the same. It wasn't just another floral perfume. It was a cocktail of natural and synthetic notes, blended so perfectly that no single flower could be picked out. That was the genius of it. Instead of smelling like roses or violets, Chanel No. 5 smelled like a woman. Not one woman in particular, every woman and no woman at the same time. It was mystery in a bottle. People didn't know what to make of it at first. Some were enchanted, others confused, but that was the point. A Parisian woman wearing number 5 wasn't announcing herself. She was intriguing you, making you lean in closer. Perfume wasn't about shouting, it was about lingering. Picture it, a dim cafe in Montparnasse. A woman sits alone at a corner table, a cigarette in one hand, a glass of wine in the other. Her dress is simple, her hair cropped short, but when she walks past your table to leave, a faint, unfamiliar scent drifts after her. Something clean, something sensual, something you can't quite name. And for the rest of the night, you keep thinking about it. That's the power of perfume. But it wasn't only Chanel. Other houses like Guerlain, Caron, and Lanvin were crafting fragrances that became as iconic as their dresses. Guerlain's Shalimar, launched in 1925, promised exoticism and romance. Caron's Tabac Blonde dared to pair the scent of tobacco with femininity, making smoking women smell even more rebellious. Perfume had moods now. It wasn't just about smelling nice. It was about telling a story. And women in Paris used it deliberately. A drop on the wrists, a dab behind the ears. Some even sprayed a little on their dresses or their scarves so the scent moved with them. Perfume was no longer just a finishing touch. It was a weapon. A gentle one, yes, but effective. Foreign visitors couldn't stop writing about it. American men especially described Parisian women not just in terms of their beauty, but their scent. She left a cloud of perfume behind her, one might write, as if the woman was less a person and more a spell that lingered in the air. And in a way, she was. Of course, not everyone approved. Traditionalists muttered that perfume was too sensual, too bold. They said it encouraged vanity. But like the short dresses and the bobbed hair, that approval only made it more thrilling. Wearing perfume became another small act of rebellion, another way to say, I am not hiding, I am here. Perfume also connected to something deeper, memory.
Smells sink into the brain in ways words and images can't. A single whiff could bring back a whole night, a whole person. Imagine a soldier returning from war, catching a familiar scent in the street and being transported back to evenings before the trenches. Perfume wasn't just allure, it was nostalgia, longing, hope, all bottled up. And then there was the marketing. Perfume ads in the 1920s were lush, dreamy, almost poetic. Women reclined in silk gowns, bottles glimmered like jewels, and the language promised transformation. Wear this, and you too will be mysterious, irresistible, unforgettable. Parisian women may not have believed all of it, but they enjoyed playing along. After all, half the fun of Allure is pretending. The bottles themselves became works of art. Simple, elegant, often with clean lines that matched the modern style of the decade. Chanel insisted her number 5 come in a square bottle, free of frills. She wanted it to look as modern as the women who wore it. And when you set that bottle on a vanity table, it didn't just hold perfume. It held the idea of sophistication. Perfume also blurred the lines between public and private. Clothes were visible. Makeup was visible. But scent was secretive. A woman's perfume was for those who got close enough to notice. It created intimacy. It built curiosity. And in a society that still demanded women play certain roles, that subtle power was irresistible. By the mid-1920s, Paris was swimming in fragrance. Dance halls smelled of powder and musk, theaters filled with clouds of Shalimar and jasmine. Even the air on the boulevards carried traces of perfume mixed with car exhaust and roasting nuts. It was intoxicating, literally. So when we talk about the dark allure of Parisian women in the 1920s, perfume has to be part of the story. It wasn't just about beauty or style. It was about crafting an atmosphere around oneself. It was about being unforgettable in ways that couldn't be written down or photographed. Perfume made women larger than life, and yet impossible to pin down. And maybe that's the real secret. You could copy the haircut, you could copy the dress, but you couldn't quite copy the scent. Because perfume doesn't just mix with skin, it mixes with memory, with presence, with personality. Each woman made it her own. And that uniqueness, that invisible halo, is what kept Parisian women at the center of the world's imagination. So, as we move deeper into the story of the 1920s, remember, Paris wasn't just a city you could see or hear. It was a city you could smell. And the Parisian woman knew it. She left her trace on the air, a silent reminder that allure isn't always in what you show. Sometimes it's in what you leave behind. When night fell in Paris during the 1920s, the city didn't go to sleep. It went out. If the cafés and salons were the heartbeat of the day, then the cabarets and dance halls were the pulse of the night. And oh, what a pulse it was! Syncopated, jazzy, smoky, and just a little bit scandalous. Cabarets weren't new in the 1920s. The famous Moulin Rouge had been spinning its windmill long before the war. But after 1918, cabarets took on a new kind of energy. People were desperate for escape, for music, for laughter. They wanted to forget the mud of the trenches, the ration books, the grief. And so they flocked to the night. Picture it, a smoky room lit by chandeliers that had seen better days, the air heavy with perfume, tobacco, and champagne. A stage with velvet curtains, maybe a little tattered at the edges. And then the lights dim. The band strikes up a jazz number. The bass thrums, the trumpet blares, and out comes a woman in sequins that catch every beam of light. The crowd cheers, whistles, claps in time. For a moment, Paris forgets. This was the world of performers like Josephine Baker, the American dancer who arrived in Paris in 1925 and quickly became the city's darling. She danced in feathers, in beads, sometimes in very little at all, with the joy and energy that electrified audiences. She was exotic, daring, and magnetic, embodying the very spirit of the decade. Parisian women adored her too, not just because she was entertaining, but because she represented freedom. She was unapologetic, bold, and playful. But cabarets weren't all about the performers. They were about the atmosphere. Tables crowded close together, strangers brushing elbows, waiters weaving between them with bottles of champagne, corks popping like little explosions of joy. It was chaotic, noisy, alive, and Parisian women thrived in that energy. The dance halls were another story. They were bigger, rowdier, and more democratic. While cabarets often catered to the fashionable set, dance halls welcomed almost everyone. Soldiers, clerks, students, and seamstresses all mingled on the same floor. For the price of admission, you could step into a world of spinning skirts, shiny shoes, and jazz that made your feet itch to move. The Charleston became the dance of the decade. Legs kicked, arms flapped, bodies moved in ways that would have horrified ballroom instructors of the 19th century. And Parisian women loved it. These dances required energy, confidence, and a willingness to look a little ridiculous, all qualities that define the new spirit of the age. Imagine a young woman in a straight, sequin dress, her bob swinging as she kicks up her heels in rhythm. She's not worrying about posture or grace. She's laughing, free, and maybe a little out of breath. And around her, the dance floor pulses with the same electricity. For many men, this was bewildering. They had grown up with waltzes and polite bows. Suddenly, they were faced with women who didn't wait to be asked. Women who danced with abandon, who smoked between songs, who sometimes paid for their own drinks. It was shocking, yes, but it was also irresistible. The dance halls were also where class boundaries blurred. Wealthy students from the Sorbonne danced alongside shop girls. Soldiers back from the front found themselves spinning secretaries across the floor. And in that blur, Parisian women found a new kind of power. They weren't just decorations, they were partners in the dance, equal in the chaos of rhythm and sweat. Of course, there were whispers. Moralists wagged their fingers, warning that all this dancing was corrupting youth, that the cabarets were dens of sin, that women who danced the Charleston were surely on the road to ruin. But the women of Paris didn't seem to care. If ruin came with jazz and champagne, well, it didn't sound so bad. And there was more than just music and dancing. Cabarets and dance halls were also places for fashion to shine. Sequin dresses, feathered headbands, long gloves, and silk stockings all found their stage here. The glitter wasn't just for show. It was part of the performance of life. Parisian women knew that stepping into these spaces meant becoming a little larger than life, even if just for a night. Foreigners were entranced. Americans, in particular, couldn't believe what they saw. In their letters home, they described Parisian nights as wild, glamorous, and intoxicating. They wrote about women who seemed fearless, dancing until dawn, laughing loudly, smoking openly. To them, Parisian women embodied freedom in a way that felt enviable and slightly scandalous. And let's not forget the music itself.
Jazz had drifted across the Atlantic with African-American musicians, many of whom found in Paris a more welcoming stage than back home. The rhythm was new, the syncopation surprising, the energy infectious. Paris embraced jazz wholeheartedly, and women embraced it most of all. It gave them permission to move, to let go, to live in the beat. But not every cabaret night was glitter and joy. Sometimes the sadness crept back in. A slow song would play, couples would sway, and memories of lost brothers and lovers would surface. The allure of the night was always tinged with the shadows of the war. Maybe that's what gave it its intensity, the sense that life was fragile and joy had to be seized while it was here. By the late 1920s, the cabarets and dance halls were firmly woven into the fabric of Parisian life. They were no longer just entertainment. They were symbols of the decade, symbols of a generation that had suffered and decided to live loudly, boldly, unapologetically. And through it all, Parisian women led the way. Whether they were on stage in sequins or on the dance floor in simple dresses, they carried the night with them. They were the laughter, the sparkle, the rhythm. They were the dark allure that kept Paris awake long past midnight. So if you close your eyes and imagine Paris at night in the 1920s, don't just think of the Eiffel Tower or the scene. Think of a smoky room, a trumpet wailing, a woman in pearls kicking up her heels, and the sound of laughter that refused to be silenced. That was Paris. That was Allure. And no one did it better than the women who danced through it all. By day, Paris shimmered with sunlight on cafe tables and glittering shop windows. By night, it pulsed with jazz and sequins in cabarets. But there was another side to the city in the 1920s, a quieter, book-lined, cigarette-smoked corner where Parisian women weren't just dancing or dazzling. They were thinking, writing, debating, and often out-talking the men who thought they ran the conversation. This was the world of the left bank, the stretch of Paris south of the Seine that became the spiritual home of artists, philosophers, and dreamers. If the right bank had money and boulevards, the left bank had ideas, and plenty of women were right there, leading the charge. Imagine a smoky cafe tucked on a narrow street, a cluster of mismatched chairs, a couple of chipped coffee cups, the faint scratch of a fountain pen across paper. Around the table sit writers, poets, painters, and at least one philosopher gesturing wildly about the meaning of life. And among them, a woman with bobbed hair, leaning back in her chair, cigarette in hand, waiting for the perfect moment to drop a line so sharp it cuts through all the noise. That was the left bank in its golden age. One of the most influential women in this scene was Sylvia Beach, though she wasn't French at all. She was American. But her little bookshop, Shakespeare and Company, became a temple for the literary lost souls of Paris. James Joyce practically lived there while he was working on Ulysses, and Ernest Hemingway borrowed books when he was too broke to buy bread. Sylvia was the quiet force behind it all, steady, encouraging, a kind of literary mother hen. Parisian women admired her because she proved that you didn't need to follow society's rules to matter. You could carve your own path, even if it smelled of ink and coffee instead of perfume. Then there were the writers who weren't just publishing men's work, but their own. Women like Colette, who scandalized and charmed Paris with her bold novels and even bolder personal life. Colette wasn't content to sit quietly in a corner. She performed on stage, wrote about love and desire in ways that made censors nervous, and lived unapologetically. She embodied the daring freedom of the 1920s, but instead of sequins and dance, she used words as her weapon. The left bank also became a crossroads for women who felt out of place elsewhere. Here, queer women could write and live more openly than in most parts of the world. Figures like Natalie Clifford Barney, the American heiress who hosted famous literary salons in Paris, gathered women together to talk about art, philosophy, and love, all while ignoring the rule book of polite society. In her gatherings, Parisian women found space to explore ideas and identities without fear of ridicule. These intellectual circles weren't always glamorous in the way we think of the Roaring Twenties. No feathers or sequins here. Instead, think notebooks stuffed in handbags, glasses of cheap wine, and conversations that stretched long past midnight. Yet the allure was just as strong. Parisian women who stepped into these circles were carving out space in a world that had tried to keep them silent. And the ideas flying around? They were big ones. Feminism, philosophy, the role of art in a broken world. These weren't small-talk café chats. They were debates about how to live, how to love, how to rebuild after the war had torn so much apart. For many women, the left bank was the first place where their voices weren't just tolerated, they were essential. It wasn't all serious, of course. For every earnest debate about art, there was also gossip, laughter, and maybe a little too much wine. These women were intellectuals, yes, but they were also human. They flirted, they feuded, they fell in and out of love, often with the same dramatic flair as their writing. And that messy, vibrant humanity gave their work an edge that people couldn't ignore. Foreigners, again, were astonished. American men like Hemingway and Fitzgerald loved to write about Parisian women as mysterious, untouchable, and endlessly fascinating. But the women themselves, they were just living. They were balancing rant with dreams, passion with survival, laughter with grief. The so-called dark allure wasn't an act. It was simply the glow of women who had decided their minds were worth hearing and their words worth printing. Even the fashion here reflected that shift. Intellectual women didn't need glitter, they needed practicality. Simple dresses, short hair, a scarf tossed carelessly around the neck. The look said, I have bigger things to do than fuss with corsets. And that, in its own way, was a revolution. The left bank in the 1920s wasn't just about ideas, it was about possibility. For Parisian women, stepping into these circles meant stepping into a future where their voices shaped art, literature, and culture. They weren't just muses anymore. They were authors, publishers, philosophers. They were the ones setting the conversation. Looking back, it's tempting to romanticize this world, to imagine every cafe table glowing with genius, every debate sparking the next great novel. The truth, of course, was messier. Some nights were full of brilliance. Others were full of petty arguments and bad poetry. But even the failures mattered because they proved that women had space to try, to experiment, to be taken seriously. And so when we talk about the allure of Parisian women in the 1920s, we can't stop at the glitter of cabarets or the sparkle of fashion. We have to look here, too, in the smoky cafés of the left bank, where women lit not just cigarettes, but ideas, where they leaned across tables, eyes sharp, voices steady, and made themselves impossible to ignore. So if you're ever lying awake, picturing Paris in those years, don't just imagine the dancing. Imagine the writing, the laughter over cheap wine, the scratch of pens.
The sound of women's voices carrying over the clatter of cups. That was allure too, the quiet, stubborn, brilliant kind. When people think of the 1920s, one image almost always pops up: the flapper. Short dress, bobbed hair, long string of pearls swinging with every step. And while it's easy to picture it as just a fun party look, the fashion of Parisian women in this era was so much more than just sparkle. It was rebellion. It was a declaration. It was a revolution stitched in silk and sequins. Let's rewind for a second. Before the 1920s, women's fashion was, well, exhausting. Layers of fabric, corsets that pinched, skirts that trailed the ground. Getting dressed in the morning wasn't just an outfit choice. It was a full-time job. Then came the Great War, and women had to work in factories, offices, hospitals. They needed clothes they could move in, breathe in, live in. So when the war ended, the old rules of fashion didn't make sense anymore. Enter the 1920s Parisian woman. She looked at corsets and said, "No thanks." She looked at floor-length skirts and said, "Too much fabric." She looked at her reflection with a sharp bob haircut and thought, "Yes, that's me." Fashion became a statement of independence. The iconic silhouette of the decade was straight and loose, dresses that skimmed the body instead of squeezing it. Waistlines dropped, sometimes to the hips, and hemlines crept scandalously upward to the knee. It may sound modest today, but at the time, knees were practically headline news. Parisian women showed them off with a mix of confidence and mischief, as if to say, "We've earned the right to be comfortable and stylish at the same time." And it wasn't just the cut of the clothes, it was the details. Sequins that sparkled under cabaret lights, fringes that danced with every Charleston step, bold geometric patterns that echoed the energy of modern art. Fashion didn't just sit quietly, it moved, it shimmered, it demanded attention. One of the most influential figures in this revolution was Coco Chanel. She stripped fashion down to its essentials: clean lines, jersey fabric, little black dresses that were as elegant as they were simple. Chanel gave women clothes that let them breathe, and in doing so, gave them freedom. Her designs whispered sophistication while shouting independence. But Chanel wasn't alone. Designers like Jean Patou and Jean Lanvin pushed boundaries too, experimenting with bold colors and playful details. Together, they turned Paris into the undisputed fashion capital of the world. Tourists came not just for the Eiffel Tower, but to see what Parisian women were wearing. Accessories told their own story. Long strands of pearls weren't just pretty, they were statements. Headbands with feathers or jewels announced that the woman wearing them wasn't afraid of standing out. Cigarette holders, sleek and dramatic, became almost like wands in the hands of women who were rewriting social magic. Even makeup transformed. Dark kohl around the eyes, crimson lips, pale powder. The look was striking, modern, a little dangerous. Of course, not everyone approved. Moralists shook their heads at the sight of women cutting their hair short, smoking in public, and showing their knees. They said it was unfeminine, reckless, even immoral. But Parisian women didn't flinch. They knew the whispers only proved that their fashion meant something. And fashion was more than just style. It was also practicality. For the first time, women's wardrobes included trousers, especially for casual wear or sports. Imagine the shock. Women cycling or playing tennis in pants? It may not seem earth-shattering now, but back then, it was as rebellious as any political speech. Parisian women wore those trousers with pride, knowing that every step they took was a tiny crack in the wall of tradition. Even hair was political. The bob cut, sleek and short, became a symbol of independence. It wasn't just a hairstyle. It was a declaration that women didn't need long, carefully styled locks to be beautiful. Some hairdressers refused to cut women's hair at first, calling it disgraceful. But the bob spread like wildfire anyway, and soon enough, Paris was full of sharp silhouettes and swinging fringes. The revolution reached beyond Paris, too. Hollywood stars like Louis Brooks and Clara Bow popularized the flapper look on screen, and suddenly women from New York to Berlin wanted to dress like Parisian women. It was global influence, powered by silk, sequins, and a little Parisian attitude. Yet for all its glamour, music, and champagne in Paris in the 1920s, there was something else always lingering in the air. Something heavier, something that clung like a shadow to every laugh and every dance step. And that was the memory of the Great War. It's easy, looking back, to think of the Roaring Twenties as all sparkle and jazz. But the truth is, the noise of the parties was partly there to drown out the silence left by the war. Paris was close to the front. People still remembered the sound of cannons echoing not too far away, the rationing, the funerals. Behind the sequins and short skirts, grief was very much alive. Parisian women, especially, carried that weight. They were the ones who had lost brothers, husbands, sons. They were the ones who had worked through the war years, holding up the city when men were gone. When the armistice came in 1918, joy and relief were real, but so was the emptiness. Hundreds of thousands of young men didn't come back. Whole neighborhoods were missing their boys, and women felt those absences every single day. That's part why the 1920s felt so urgent, why women threw themselves into dancing, smoking, laughing, because they knew how fragile life could be. They had watched it break. And so, the dark allure of Parisian women wasn't just about style or confidence. It was about that mix of joy and sorrow, like someone who laughs a little louder because they've already cried enough.
You could see it in the cafés, where conversations sometimes turned from jokes to silence when someone mentioned a name. You could feel it in the cabarets when the band shifted from a hot jazz number to a slow, mournful tune and couples swayed quietly, remembering. Even fashion carried it. Black dresses weren't always just chic, they were also echoes of mourning. And it wasn't just grief. The war had changed how women saw themselves. During those 4 long years, they'd stepped into roles they'd never been allowed to touch before. Running businesses, driving ambulances, working in offices. They proved, to themselves most of all, that they could survive without being tucked into the narrow boxes society had drawn for them. After the war, many weren't willing to go back. Still, the shadow lingered. Paris was a city full of memorials, official and unofficial, statues of soldiers, plaques on walls, cemeteries filled with endless rows of crosses. Families visited graves on Sundays, laid flowers, whispered names, and women carried that loss in the way they moved through the world, with a kind of seriousness beneath the sparkle. Sometimes, the shadow crept into literature, too. Writers of the time often circled back to themes of loss, disillusionment, and searching for meaning. Parisian women reading these works weren't just entertained, they were nodding along, because they felt it too. Behind the lipstick and pearls, there was a generation scarred by something they could never fully explain. But here's the paradox. The very shadow of the war is what gave the decade its brightness. It's what made the laughter louder, the dancing wilder, the fashion bolder. Parisian women weren't ignoring the grief, they were transforming it, taking the heaviness and flipping it into something fierce and beautiful. Think of Josephine Baker twirling on stage, feathers flying. People cheered not just because it was fun, but because it was healing. Think of a woman lighting a cigarette at a cafe table, staring down a future she refused to fear. These were acts of defiance, born out of pain. Foreigners often looked at Parisian women and thought, how mysterious, how dark, how alluring. But part of that allure was the war's shadow. It was the unspoken knowledge that beauty doesn't last forever, so you may as well live it now. It was charm mixed with resilience, sparkle hiding scars. And yet, women also carried guilt. Some whispered that it was wrong to laugh too loudly when so many were gone.
that wearing short skirts or dancing until dawn was disrespectful to the dead. But most women ignored those whispers. They weren't dishonoring anyone. They were honoring life itself, the one gift the war hadn't stolen from them. Walk the streets of Paris in 1925, and you'd see both sides. A fashionable woman in pearls passing a war memorial. A cabaret dancer hurrying past a row of crutches leaned against a wall. The city was never just one thing. It was joy and grief side by side. And that's what gave Parisian women their depth. They weren't just pretty faces in sequined dresses. They were survivors. They had seen loss, endured silence, and chosen to laugh anyway. That choice, that conscious decision to live loudly after so much death, is what gave them that mysterious glow people couldn't quite explain. So, as you drift to sleep tonight, picture it this way. Paris in the 1920s wasn't just a party. It was a balancing act. A city lit up at night, but always with a shadow at the edges. Women smiling, but with memories behind their eyes. Dresses glittering, but sometimes black. It was beautiful, fragile, fleeting, and that's exactly what made it unforgettable. Paris in the 1920s wasn't just for Parisians. The city had become a magnet, pulling in curious souls from across the world. Writers, painters, musicians, adventurers all flocked to the boulevards and cafés, chasing that mysterious Parisian magic they'd heard so much about. And at the center of their fascination were the women. Parisian women seemed, to these outsiders, like living works of art, daring, glamorous, and just a little untouchable. Americans in particular couldn't get enough. After the First World War, thousands of young Americans found themselves stationed in France, and many decided not to go home. Why would they, when Paris offered jazz, cheap wine, and women who weren't bound by the same strict rules as back in the States? Back home, prohibition made even a glass of champagne illegal. In Paris, it flowed like water. Back home, women were expected to behave modestly. In Paris, they smoked, danced, and debated philosophy at midnight. No wonder the Americans were enchanted. Writers like Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald made Paris their playground. They spent afternoons in left-bank cafés scribbling notes while quietly observing Parisian women glide past in their chic dresses and bobbed hair. To them, these women were the embodiment of freedom, elegant yet effortless, confident without apology. Hemingway famously described Paris as a movable feast, and women were a large part of that feast, adding spice and allure to the city's flavor. It wasn't just Americans. British travelers came too, often arriving with stiff collars and equally stiff expectations. And then they saw Parisian women laughing loudly in public or dancing the Charleston without care, and their monocles nearly popped out. Some were scandalized. Others were thrilled. Either way, they went home with stories that made their friends raise eyebrows. Artists were especially captivated. Painters sketched women in smoky cabarets, photographers tried to capture their effortless style, and musicians dedicated songs to them. Parisian women became muses, not just for one artist, but for a whole generation of foreigners trying to capture what made them different. Was it their elegance, their wit, their ability to balance sadness and joy? Outsiders couldn't quite pin it down, which only made the allure stronger. They weren't always interested in the intellectual debates on the left bank or the grief women carried from the war. They wanted sequins, laughter, and mystery. And so Parisian women sometimes leaned into the performance, giving the foreigners the Paris they came for. But here's the thing. Even if the foreign gaze simplified them, it also spread their influence. Women across the world clipped magazine photos of Parisian fashion, copied their hairstyles, and dreamed of walking those same boulevards. The allure of Parisian women became international, shaping beauty standards and cultural ideals far beyond the city's borders. Of course, not all encounters were flattering. Some foreigners stumbled into cabarets expecting easy romance, only to find Parisian women sharp-tongued and uninterested. Others learned the hard way that confidence didn't mean availability. Parisian women weren't props in someone else's vacation. They had their own lives, dreams, and standards. Still, the fascination never dimmed. Letters sent home gushed about their elegance. Travel diaries marveled at their independence, and novels written by visiting writers kept the legend alive long after the travelers had gone. The gaze of the outsider, whether a romantic or critical, only added to the myth of Parisian allure. So if you picture Paris in the 1920s through foreign eyes, imagine this: an American writer scribbling in a café, glancing up every so often at a woman with pearls and a cigarette, wondering how she manages to look so effortlessly alive. A British tourist adjusting his hat nervously as a woman laughs too loudly for his comfort. A painter in Montparnasse sketching the curve of a dancer's dress, trying to bottle the energy of a whole city in one line. Parisian women, through the foreign gaze, became more than themselves. They became symbols of freedom, of beauty, of mystery. And while the real women knew life was more complicated, they also understood the power of that image. Sometimes they even used it to their advantage. Because if the world insists on seeing you as alluring, you may as well make it work for you. When we imagine Paris in the 1920s, it's easy to see only the glamour, the sequins, the feathers, the champagne glasses raised under the glow of café lamps. Parisian women became the face of that glamour. They danced in glittering cabarets, strolled the boulevards in silk dresses, and turned smoky cafés into stages where fashion and wit mattered just as much as the conversation. But beneath the sparkle was a reality far more complicated. The 1920s were a time of contradictions. For every moment of beauty, there was a shadow. For every laugh over a cocktail, there was a sigh over unpaid rent. This was the era of both glamour and grit. Let's start with the glamour. Paris had rebuilt itself after the horrors of the First World War, or at least it tried to. The city leaned hard into beauty and entertainment as a kind of therapy. Women were central to this new identity. They dressed with boldness, short skirts, bobbed hair, daring makeup. They smoked cigarettes with an air of rebellion, as if each puff declared, "I make my own rules." In cafés, they were dazzling. Writers compared their style to poetry. Artists begged them to sit for portraits. Designers from Coco Chanel to Jan Langevin built entire empires on the idea that Parisian women embodied sophistication. Their clothes weren't just garments, they were symbols. A Chanel dress wasn't about lace and ribbons anymore. It was about freedom, simplicity, and modern life. Women walking the streets of Paris became walking billboards for this new independence. The nightlife only added to the shine. At the Moulin Rouge or the Folies Bergère, women took center stage. Dancers twirled in feathers and sequins, while singers in satin gowns belted out tunes that made audiences swoon. Tourists scribbled postcards about how Paris never slept, and always women were at the heart of the picture. To outsiders, they seemed to live in a dream world of cocktails, dance steps, and moonlight strolls. But then came the grit. Behind the glimmering surface, many Parisian women were struggling. The war had taken away brothers, fathers, and husbands. Widows were everywhere, some young enough to still be in their 20s. These women carried grief that no amount of lipstick could fully hide. They dressed beautifully, yes, but sometimes it was armor, a way to keep going when life felt heavy. Money was another struggle.
Not every woman could afford Chanel dresses or café cocktails. Many worked long hours as seamstresses, shop clerks, or waitresses, stretching wages that barely covered rent. Some turned to cabaret not out of love for dancing, but because it paid better than factory work. Even Josephine Baker, who looked like the picture of joy on stage, often spoke of the exhausting rehearsals and the pressure to always smile for an audience. Even those who had money faced challenges. Independence was exciting, but it also came with criticism. Some men rolled their eyes at women in trousers or short skirts, calling them unfeminine. Others whispered behind their backs, saying women were forgetting their place. Every glass of wine, every cigarette, every bold laugh in public was a tiny act of resistance. The glamour wasn't just fun, it was a fight. And there were darker corners still. Not all Parisian women were celebrated muses in salons. Many were trapped in poverty, working as laundresses or cleaners for wealthier families. Others turned to sex work, a trade that outsiders romanticized, but which often carried danger and exploitation. The same city that put sequins on stage also had neighborhoods where women struggled to survive, far from the postcard version of Paris. This is what makes the allure of Parisian women in the 1920s so layered. The glamour was real, but it was incomplete without the grit. They knew how to shine under café lights, but they also knew how to roll up their sleeves and fight through hardship. They could look like movie stars one moment and spend the next balancing a budget, caring for children, or mourning a loss. And perhaps this balance, the glamour and the grit, is what made Parisian women so endlessly fascinating. They weren't one-dimensional. They weren't just party girls or grieving widows.
They were both, sometimes in the same hour. They carried sorrow and beauty in equal measure, and somehow made it look effortless. So if you picture Paris in the 1920s, don't just see the sparkle of sequins or the golden glow of the cafes. Imagine, too, the tired feet, the quiet tears, the unglamorous work that kept life moving. That mixture, messy as it was, gave Parisian women their depth. They weren't just fashion icons or party queens, they were human beings, resilient and radiant, balancing a city's pain and joy on their shoulders. That's the real allure, not just the glamour, but the grit that made the glamour possible. If the 1920s had a mascot, it would be the flapper. And in Paris, the flapper wasn't just a passing trend. She was practically a revolution wrapped in beads and bobbed hair. Imagine a young woman with a sleek dress that brushed her knees, a cigarette holder dangling from her fingers, and eyes lined with kohl as dark as midnight. She wasn't interested in sitting quietly in the corner. She wanted to dance, laugh, and take up space. And in the City of Light, she had the perfect stage. The term flapper originally came from English slang, meaning a young woman whose wings weren't fully grown. By the 1920s, it had become shorthand for a new kind of woman, independent, modern, and a little bit rebellious. In America, flappers shocked their parents by cutting their hair short, drinking in speakeasies, and dancing the Charleston until sunrise. In Paris, though, the flapper's spirit went even further. Parisian flappers weren't just imitating a trend, they embodied it in their own unique style. Think of them as flappers with a Parisian twist, equal parts chic and daring. They wore dresses that shimmered under café lights, often straight and loose-fitting, ditching the corsets of their mothers. Their hair, cut into sharp bobs, gave them a look of boldness. And their makeup? Let's just say no one was going for the natural look. Dark lipstick, rouged cheeks, dramatic eyes. It was glamour with an edge. But what really defined the Parisian flapper wasn't just her clothes, it was her attitude. She wasn't afraid to smoke in public, to laugh loudly, or to debate politics over a glass of wine. She took taxis alone. She danced with whoever she pleased, and she often earned her own money.
Some were models, some worked in fashion houses, others in offices or shops. Independence wasn't just a look, it was a lifestyle. The cafés of Montparnasse and Montmartre became their playgrounds. Picture a smoky room filled with jazz, the clinking of glasses, and a swirl of laughter. Flappers danced the Charleston until beads flew from their dresses. They drank cocktails with names that sounded more dangerous than they were. They talked about art, poetry, and sometimes nothing at all. To them, the night wasn't for sleep, it was for living. Foreign visitors were mesmerized. American flappers seemed daring back home, but Parisian flappers, they took things up a notch. Tourists scribbled about these women in diaries, often with a mix of admiration and shock. They couldn't quite decide if Parisian flappers were stylish rebels or charming troublemakers. Maybe they were both. Of course, not everyone approved. Older generations frowned at these young women, calling them reckless or unfeminine. Newspapers occasionally wrote scathing pieces about modern girls ruining society with their short skirts and bold lipstick. But the flappers didn't care. In fact, they thrived on the disapproval. Each disapproving glare was proof they were breaking old rules, and that was the whole point. One of the flappers' favorite weapons was dance. The Charleston, with its wild kicks and spins, became the anthem of the era. It was chaotic, fun, and just a little bit scandalous. Jazz bands in Paris played it night after night, and flappers made the dance floors their domain. Where their mothers had waltzed in proper gowns, they bounced and twirled in dresses that let them move freely. It wasn't just a dance. It was liberation set to music. Fashion designers fueled the flapper spirit. Coco Chanel, already a household name, offered clothes that were simple, elegant, and perfect for movement. No stiff corsets, no unnecessary frills, just clean lines and modern flair. Jean Lanvin and Jean Pateau also designed dresses that spoke to this new lifestyle. Suddenly, fashion wasn't about impressing others, it was about expressing freedom. But let's be clear, not every Parisian woman in the 1920s was a flapper. Just like today, trends were uneven. Many women still preferred traditional roles, and plenty of families clung to old customs. Yet the flapper loomed large in the cultural imagination. She wasn't the majority, but she was the symbol of what was possible. And maybe that's why the flapper became such an icon. She represented change in a city that was itself reinventing after the war. She wasn't weighed down by grief or tradition, at least not on the surface. Instead, she embodied joy, energy, and defiance. She showed that women could step into the spotlight and not apologize for it. Still, the life of a flapper wasn't always endless fun. The same freedom that made her exciting also left her vulnerable to criticism and risk. Some flappers burned out quickly, struggling with money or health after too many late nights. Others faced judgment from families who saw them as irresponsible. And while the image of the carefree Parisian flapper glittered in magazines and movies, the reality was often more complicated. Behind the laughter and lipstick, many were just young women trying to find their place in a fast-changing world. Yet their impact was undeniable. Parisian flappers helped redefine what it meant to be a modern woman. They showed that independence could be stylish, that joy could be rebellious, and that femininity wasn't something to be boxed in by tradition. They weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. They were symbols of possibility, and they made the world take notice. So when you imagine Paris in the 1920s, don't just picture monuments or smoky cafés. Picture the flapper, beads sparkling as she spins on the dance floor, a sly smile as she lights another cigarette, and the sound of jazz carrying her into the night. She was more than a fashion trend. She was a revolution in heels. If Paris in the 1920s had a crown, fashion was its brightest jewel. And Parisian women wore that jewel with pride. To outsiders, their style seemed almost magical, effortless, chic, and impossible to copy. But behind those sleek silhouettes and dazzling gowns were the designers and icons who redefined what it meant to look modern. Fashion wasn't just fabric in Paris. It was identity, rebellion, and art stitched into every seam. At the center of it all stood Coco Chanel. By the 1920s, she was already a household name, but this was the decade when her vision reshaped women's wardrobes around the world. Chanel didn't just sell dresses, she sold freedom. Out went the corsets and heavy skirts. In came loose, comfortable lines that let women move, breathe, and dance. Her famous little black dress became the uniform of chic Parisian women. Simple, elegant, and just daring enough to shock those who thought black should only be for mourning. Chanel's designs whispered, "I don't need lace or frills to turn heads. My confidence is enough."
Then there was Jeanne Lanvin, whose style leaned toward romantic elegance. Her dresses often shimmered with embroidery and delicate detail, making them favorites among women who wanted glamour without losing softness. If Chanel was about sharp modernity, Lanvin was about dreamy sophistication. Parisian women could choose which mood suited them best, practical and sleek, or romantic and graceful. Jean Patou added another flavor to the mix. He became known for sporty chic. His clothes were perfect for women who embraced the active lifestyle of the new decade: tennis, swimming, golf. Patou gave women freedom to look stylish while actually moving, which was revolutionary. Imagine playing tennis in a corset. Not exactly fun. Patou said no to that nonsense and gave women dresses that worked on the court and at the cafe afterward. But designers weren't the only forces shaping Parisian fashion. The women themselves, the icons who wore the clothes, gave the style its power. Josephine Baker wasn't just a performer. She was a walking fashion statement. Her stage costumes with feathers, pearls, and daring cuts redefined what glamour could look like. Offstage, she favored chic Parisian designs, mixing playfulness with sophistication. Magazines around the world published her photos, and suddenly everyone wanted a little of that Baker sparkle. Actresses and socialites also played their part. Women like Louise Brooks, though American, became fashion idols in Paris, with her sharp bob and sleek dresses. Parisian women clipped her photos from magazines, while designers rushed to recreate her style. Fashion was contagious in the 1920s, spreading from stages and film reels to sidewalks and salons. The magic of Parisian fashion lay not just in the clothes, but in the philosophy behind them. Clothes weren't cages anymore. They were expressions. A woman in a Chanel suit could walk into a room and feel powerful. A woman in a Lanvin gown could twirl on a dance floor and feel radiant. A woman in Patou sportswear could climb into a convertible and feel unstoppable. The message was clear. Fashion wasn't about pleasing others. It was about defining yourself. And let's not forget accessories. Long strings of pearls became practically mandatory for flappers. Cloche hats hugged close to the head, giving women a sleek silhouette that matched their bobbed hair. Shoes shifted from delicate heels to sturdy pumps made for dancing the Charleston. Even makeup became part of fashion. Dark lipstick, dramatic eyes, and rouge cheeks were as essential as a silk dress. Of course, fashion wasn't only for the wealthy. Magazines and department stores helped spread trends to women of all classes. Even if you couldn't afford Chanel, you could copy her style with cheaper fabrics. Seamstresses all over Paris became experts at recreating designer looks for a fraction of the cost. The working-class girl who spent her days at a shop counter could still step out at night looking every bit the modern Parisian. But here's the twist. Not everyone was thrilled about these changes. Traditionalists complained that women's clothes were too simple, too masculine, or too daring. Where are the curves, they grumbled. Where are the ruffles? But the flappers and fashion-forward women just laughed and lit another cigarette. They didn't care about the old rules. Clothes weren't just about beauty anymore. They were about power. And power looked good. The world noticed.
American tourists returned home gushing about the elegance of Parisian women. British magazines published spreads on the latest Paris trends. Even Hollywood borrowed from Paris fashion, dressing its stars in gowns inspired by French designers. Paris had always been a style capital, but in the 1920s, it wasn't just leading fashion, it was rewriting it. So picture it, a Parisian woman in 1926, walking down the Champs-Élysées. She's wearing a Chanel dress, pearls swinging as she strides. Her bobbed hair peeks out from beneath a cloche hat. Her lipstick is bold. Her shoes click smartly against the pavement, and her confidence makes strangers turn their heads. She doesn't look like her mother or grandmother. She looks like the future. That's what fashion gave Parisian women in the 1920s, the chance to embody tomorrow. To declare with every dress, every haircut, every daring bit of rouge that they were not just ornaments, they were individuals. Glamorous, yes, but also free. Desire in Paris during the 1920s wasn't just about stolen kisses or smoky glances across café tables. It was political. In a city buzzing with new freedoms, the way women loved, flirted, and lived became a stage where power, independence, and rebellion all played out. Parisian women weren't only admired for their beauty, they were feared, judged, and celebrated for what that beauty meant in a world still trying to control them. After the First World War, society had been shaken to its core. Old traditions felt shaky, and new possibilities hovered in the air. Women had stepped into roles during the war that had once belonged to men, and many weren't about to step back into silence. Their independence spilled into how they dressed, how they smoked, and yes, how they loved. Romance in Paris during the 1920s wasn't just about courtship and chaperones, it was about choice, and that choice terrified some people. Parisian women of the 1920s often turned the act of being desired into a kind of power. They knew men watched them in cafés, admired their style, and whispered about them in foreign letters. Instead of shying away, they leaned into it. A bobbed haircut wasn't just fashion, it was a signal. Short skirts weren't only stylish, they were statements. To desire a Parisian woman in the 1920s was to desire modernity itself. Of course, desire also became a battleground. Traditionalists grumbled that women were becoming too bold, too free. The newspapers sometimes painted flappers as dangerous temptresses, leading men astray. The church issued warnings about modesty. But women knew that controlling desire, who gets it, who directs it, and who owns it, was really about controlling freedom. To reject those rules was more than rebellion. It was politics, stitched into lipstick and laughter. This era also saw women openly challenging ideas about sexuality. Some Parisian women lived and loved beyond the rigid boundaries of heterosexual norms, forming communities that thrived in salons, bars, and private apartments. Writers like Colette explored themes of same-sex desire in their work, daring to put on stage and paper what many only whispered about. For the first time in certain corners of Paris at least, women could imagine love that wasn't dictated by traditional marriage. That freedom attracted outsiders too. Foreigners came to Paris not only for art and jazz, but also for the possibility of living more openly. Desire in Paris had its own rhythm, less bound by rules, more willing to experiment. For Parisian women, this meant that they weren't just objects of fascination. They were leaders in shaping new ideas of what love and attraction could look like. But let's not over-romanticize. The politics of desire weren't always fair. Many women faced judgment if they stepped too far from the line society allowed. Double standards thrived. A man who enjoyed Paris nightlife was adventurous. A woman who did the same could be labeled immoral. Some women paid a steep price for their freedom, facing gossip, isolation, or worse. The power of desire was thrilling, but it could also be dangerous.
At the same time, the economic side of desire played its part. Cabaret dancers and entertainers often had to navigate the thin line between performance and objectification.
Their costumes shimmered, their dances dazzled, but behind the feathers and sequins was the reality of survival. Desire sold tickets, filled theaters, and kept the city's nightlife alive. For many women, leaning into desire wasn't just a game, it was a livelihood. And yet, for all the struggles, there was something undeniably transformative about this moment. Parisian women showed that desire wasn't just about men wanting women, it was about women wanting lives, opportunities, and choices that had once been denied. They could turn desire into currency, into power, into freedom. They could flip the script. Imagine sitting in a cafe in 1927. A woman across the room wears pearls and a sharp bob. She meets your gaze, not shyly, but directly. In that look is centuries of history being rewritten. She isn't waiting for permission. She isn't asking for approval. She knows her presence is magnetic, and she owns it. That's not just flirtation. That's politics. In the end, the politics of desire in the 1920s Paris weren't about whether women were beautiful. They always had been. What was new was how they used that beauty and whether the world could accept it. Some tried to cage it, others tried to romanticize it, but Parisian women kept dancing, kept laughing, kept choosing. And in that dance between glamour and freedom, they revealed a truth that still lingers. Desire is never just personal. It's about who has the power to say yes, who has the courage to say no, and who gets to write the rules. If cafés were the heart of Paris in the 1920s, then books were its soul. And among the stacks of novels, essays, and poems, Parisian women carved out a space for themselves, not just as muses, but as writers, thinkers, and critics. The image of the glamorous Parisian woman often came wrapped in pearls and silk, but some of the most fascinating women of the era wore ink stains on their fingers and carried notebooks under their arms. Paris had always attracted writers, but the 1920s were different. The city pulsed with new ideas, and women were right in the middle of it. They wrote about love and independence, about politics and art, about the very streets they walked. Some were born Parisians, others found their way to the city from far-off places, but all of them shaped the literary mood of the decade. One of the most striking figures was Colette. Already an established writer by the 1920s, she embodied the daring spirit of the age. Colette's novels explored themes of sensuality, independence, and the inner lives of women in a way that was bold for its time. She didn't shy away from topics that others found scandalous. Her writing blurred the line between life and literature. Sometimes people couldn't tell if she was describing her characters or herself. And that was part of the allure. Colette wasn't just telling stories. She was rewriting what it meant to be a woman on the page. Then there were the expatriates who found a second home in Paris. Gertrude Stein, though American, became a central figure in Parisian literary circles. Her salon was legendary, a gathering place where painters like Picasso and writers like Hemingway rubbed shoulders. Stein herself was fiercely intellectual, experimental in her writing, and unapologetically herself. She lived openly with her partner, Alice B. Toklas, defying conventions with a calm confidence. For many young women writers, she was proof that there was room in literature for female voices that refused to be silenced or softened. The presence of these literary ladies reshaped Parisian culture. Women were no longer just the inspirations behind male novels. They were writing their own. They weren't simply objects of admiration in poems, they were crafting verses of their own, sometimes sharper, sometimes gentler, but always honest. Their words carried weight in a world that often tried to dismiss female voices. Bookshops, too, became sanctuaries. Take Shakespeare and Company, Sylvia Beach's famous bookstore on the left bank. Beach wasn't just a bookseller. She was a lifeline for the literary community. She published James Joyce's Ulysses when no one else dared, and her shop became a safe space for writers and readers alike. Parisian women, whether writers or readers, found in these bookshops a place where ideas could bloom without judgment. For many women, writing wasn't just a hobby. It was a way to claim space in a society still unsure what to do with independent women. Through novels and essays, they pushed back against stereotypes. They challenged the idea that women were delicate, passive, or silent. Their pens were as bold as their fashion, their paragraphs as daring as their dances in the cafés. Of course, the literary scene wasn't without its struggles. Women writers often faced skepticism. Critics sometimes dismissed their work as frivolous or overly emotional, while praising men for writing about the exact same subjects. Some women published under pseudonyms to be taken seriously. Others simply kept writing, letting their success speak louder than prejudice. Still, the impact of these literary ladies was undeniable. They gave women readers stories in which they could see themselves, not just as wives or ornaments, but as complex, flawed, fascinating human beings. They inspired other women to pick up the pen, to write their own lives into the margins of history. And beyond the pages, they lived in ways that fueled the mythology of Parisian women. Imagine Cloche performing on stage, her life a blend of literature and theater. Or Gertrude Stein presiding over her salon with wit sharp enough to cut glass. Or Sylvia Beach quietly but firmly holding the reins of a bookstore that would become a legend. Each one added a different shade to the portrait of the Parisian woman, not only glamorous and alluring, but also thoughtful, creative, and defiantly intellectual. Literature in the 1920s Paris wasn't always an easy path for women, but it was a powerful one. Their stories traveled beyond the city, reaching readers in London, New York, and beyond. Parisian women, through their words, became global voices. And while their café conversations may have ended at midnight, their sentences lingered far longer. So when we think about the allure of Parisian women in this era, it isn't just about sequins and smoky cabarets. It's also about ink on paper, about the quiet power of words written in small apartments and shared in crowded bookshops. It's about women who dared to write themselves into history, not as background characters, but as authors of their own lives. In the flicker of a lamp, in the hum of a cafe, in the silence of a library corner, Parisian women shaped the stories that still echo today. The 1920s eventually slipped away, as all decades do. Paris moved into the 1930s, and with it came new challenges: economic struggles, political tensions, and the looming shadow of war. Yet, the image of the Parisian woman from the Roaring Twenties never really faded. Instead, it lingered, like a perfume that stays in the air long after someone has left the room. When we look back now, almost a century later, it's easy to see why that allure remains so strong.
The Parisian women of the 1920s weren't just stylish, they were symbols of change. They represented freedom, creativity, and the refusal to be boxed in. Their clothes might look vintage to us today, their dances a little quaint, but the spirit they carried still feels modern. Think about the flapper dresses, for example. Those dropped waistlines and beaded hems weren't just about fashion. They were quiet rebellions against corsets and layers of fabric that had weighed women down for generations. The short haircuts, the bold lipstick, the daring outfits, all of it was a declaration that women didn't need to dress for society's approval. They dressed for themselves. That's a legacy you can still spot in fashion runways and city streets around the world. But the legacy isn't only about appearances. The intellectual and artistic influence of Parisian women from that era still echoes. Writers like Colette and salons led by Gertrude Stein laid foundations for women to be taken seriously in literature and art. Performers like Josephine Baker opened doors for discussions on race, identity, and what it meant to belong. Designers like Coco Chanel turned fashion into a language of independence. Each one left behind more than just their own story. They shifted the course of culture.
Even the way we imagine Paris owes something to these women. The dreamy picture of the city as a place of romance, creativity, and midnight adventures. That's partly their doing. They helped brand Paris as not just a capital of France, but a capital of imagination. And let's be honest, who hasn't at least once thought about sipping coffee at a Paris cafe, pretending to be part of that 1920s magic? The allure also lives on in the ongoing fight for women's freedom and recognition. In the 1920s, Parisian women were pushing boundaries in a society that wasn't always ready for them. Today, women around the world still push against barriers, sometimes different ones, sometimes the same ones. The courage of those Parisian women serves as both inspiration and reminder. Progress doesn't come overnight, but every step matters. Of course, not everything about the era was glamorous. The world outside the Paris cafés and nightclubs had its share of inequality, poverty, and struggle. But perhaps that's why the allure of the Parisian woman shines so brightly in memory. Because in the middle of chaos, she managed to represent beauty, strength, and a daring kind of hope. She wasn't perfect, and neither was her world, but her existence suggested that something new was possible. When we talk about the Parisian woman of the 1920s, we're not really talking about one single person. She was many things all at once: a dancer, a writer, a painter, a designer, a dreamer. She could be Colette with her novels, Josephine Baker with her performances, Coco Chanel with her bold designs, or an unnamed young woman strolling down the Boulevard Saint-Germain with her hair cut short and her eyes set on the future. The allure is in the variety, in the freedom to be many things at once. So what is the legacy of all this? It's not just in the museums, the biographies, or the history books. It's in the little everyday freedoms we often take for granted. The ability to choose how to dress, what to write, where to go, and who to be. The Parisian women of the 1920s didn't achieve all of that alone, of course, but they played their part in nudging the world a little further forward. As we close this chapter, imagine Paris once more at night. The glow of gas lamps along the Seine, the soft chatter spilling out of cafés, the sound of jazz echoing from a club. In the middle of it all, a woman walks by, her dress shimmering, her laughter unbothered, her confidence magnetic. You don't know her name, but you know her type. She is the Parisian woman of the 1920s, and her allure still lingers, timeless and unforgettable. And maybe that's the final secret. The allure isn't meant to be fully explained. It's meant to be felt. It's in the way a story from a century ago can still make us pause, smile, and dream just a little before drifting off to sleep.